Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be looking at Zorba the Greek by the Greek writer Nikos Kazantzakis. This is part of your paper on European fiction. Nikos Kazantzakis was born in 1883 on the island of Crete. Crete is an island on the Mediterranean Sea. It is the largest and the most populous of the Greek islands. The island has a very interesting and unique history and plays a central part in much of his writing. Crete is the birthplace of Europe's first advanced civilization, which flourished in 3000 BC. It later came under the rule of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, Andalusian Arabs, Venetian Republic, and finally the Ottoman Empire, before being a part of the modern Greek state. Kazantzakis was born at a time when Crete was still under the rule of the Turks and witnessed the last of the uprisings by the Cretan people who wanted to join Greece. Crete for him had a unique physical and spiritual location as a nation that belonged neither to the East nor the West. He went to the University of Paris in 1907 to study philosophy and came under the influence of Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. His doctoral dissertation was on Nietzsche, and both Nietzsche and Bergson had a huge influence on his writing and philosophy. He traveled widely across Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia, and his travels brought him closer into contact with various philosophies and theories. The struggle to find the truth in religion and spirituality was central to his works. He was Greek Orthodox, but you can see the influence of other philosophies and religions on him, which made him question certain Christian morals and values. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature 9 times. Some of his most famous works are Zorba the Greek, which was published in 1946, The Last Temptation of Christ, both of which were made into movies, very controversial movies. Christ Recrucified, Captain Michaelis, these are some of his works. He has also written plays, travel books, philosophical essays, etc. In Zorba the Greek, we have two characters around whom almost all of the action revolves. One is the narrator, the man that Zorba calls boss. He is a man who is obsessed with intellectual and spiritual concerns. He is presented as a bookworm. When the book opens, we find him sitting in a dockside cafe waiting for the rain to stop so his ship to Crete can depart. The other is our eponymous hero, Zorba. He is in every way the exact opposite of the narrator. He dances, he plays the santuri, and indulges in sensual pleasures. His zest for life makes him the perfect companion for our narrator. The narrator is on his way to Crete to open up a closed lignite mine when he meets Zorba. Zorba comes straight up to him and asks if the narrator is going to take him along with him. The narrator is taken aback by this unexpected request from the strange man. In the conversation that follows, Zorba tells the narrator of his love of his santuri, which is a stringed musical instrument, and the crazy tale of how he learned to play it. The narrator is so astonished by Zorba's gusto for life that he decides to take Zorba along with him to Crete. In return, Zorba would serve as the foreman of the mining project, cook for him, and more importantly, relate stories from his life to the narrator. When the narrator suggests that Zorba can also play the santuri for him, he emphasizes that he can only play when he desires to and not through obligation. They are an unlikely couple, almost the opposite, yet they fit in with each other like two pieces of a puzzle. The one, an obvious intellectual who knows nothing about any kind of physical work, let alone about mining. And the other, a man of action, the spirit of life, who simply seems to be following his heart and instinct. Zorba is much older than the narrator, but even as an older man, he has a huge zest for life, an enthusiasm for wine, women, and hard work. The narrator seems to think that Zorba is the man he had sought so long in vain. Zorba has traveled all over the world and has had an array of rich and unusual experiences which the narrator is eager to learn more about. He says, "This Zorba was precisely the person I had been seeking for such a long time and not finding. A vivacious heart, a warm voice, a great unrefined, unsophisticated soul, with its umbilical cord not yet severed from Mother Earth. Using the simplest human speech, this workman made clear for me the meaning of love, art, beauty, purity, passion." The two men thus set out on an adventure that will change them both forever. They land on Crete and find their way into the village. Once at the village, they decide to take their lodging in a hotel run by Madame Hortense. Madame Hortense was a French woman who seemed to have had a lot of colorful experiences as a young woman. She was a mistress to many important men and now, in her old age, runs a hotel in Crete. Zorba is delighted by the thought of encountering the widow, and he is not disappointed. Madame Hortense now spends her time dreaming about the past and is sad that she is growing old and losing her good looks. She holds on to her youth with her thick makeup and colorful, bright clothes. She is haunted by her many lovers who have all abandoned her. But Zorba ignites in her a passion and a hope that her life might get better. Zorba gives her an endearing name, Bouboulina. Her pitiful death in the end is tragic. Once on the island, Zorba starts to work in the mine, choosing and supervising the workers, while the narrator works on his manuscript on Buddha. In the evenings, Zorba would return and cook for his boss, and the narrator would beg Zorba to tell his many stories of adventure and war and women. The narrator marvels at Zorba's innate intelligence. He says, "I thought to myself, this man did not go to school, yet his mind is not impaired. He has seen, done, and suffered much. His intellect has been opened and his heart enlarged without losing its primordial stout-heartedness. All the problems that are so complicated and unsolvable for us, he solves them with a single sword strike." Zorba comes up with his plan to build a huge cable system in order to bring the logs from up the mountain top. This is so that he could build a sturdier frame for the mine and also to sell off the extra log in order to make more money. But he lacks the confidence to do it, as Zorba himself states in the beginning of the book. He has a reputation of reducing everything to dust and black smut wherever he goes. In fact, he says that people call him mildew fungus for this reason. When the narrator states that he has implicit trust in Zorba, he is very pleased and starts dancing maniacally. Zorba dances whenever he is overwhelmed. He dances to express himself when words fail him. When the narrator states that he has implicit trust in Zorba, he is very pleased and starts dancing maniacally. He dances whenever he is overwhelmed. He dances to express himself when words fail him. For him, it is also a form of purgation. He narrates the story of how he danced when his young son died. People all around him thought that he had gone mad, but he felt that if he had not danced then, he would have gone mad with grief. Dance and music is to him what words are to the narrator, a means of expressing a higher order of things. At the end of the novel, the narrator asks Zorba to teach him to dance, a symbolic entry into the sensual world of Zorba. In order to execute the crazy plan that Zorba comes up with, he must first negotiate with the monks at the monastery on top of the mountain from where he hopes to get the logs. Zorba also tells the narrator that he must go to a nearby town to buy the cables, ropes, and other things necessary to build his contraption. Kazantzakis was a staunch critic of the principles of the established Church of Christianity. The monks in the book further bring out the hypocrisy of the church with all its rituals and superstitions. The monks are presented as greedy, materialistic, and perverted. Even the villagers are mocked for their false sense of faith and superstition. Kazantzakis is infamous for his views on Christianity, but he was still a spiritual man who concerned himself with the constant search for meaning. Zorba sets off to the nearby city to purchase the necessary equipments. Bubelina is very sad at his leaving and worries that he would find another lover. The narrator is also worried because he thinks that Zorba might not return, he might take too long, or squander off his limited funds. Zorba does exactly what they worried he would do. He finds a woman, Lola, with whom he stays a number of days and nights, and he spends much more money than he initially had said he would. He writes a humorous, although very sexist, letter telling all about it, and the boss finds it impossible to remain angry with Zorba. Madame Hortense shows up asking if there has been a letter for her from Zorba. The narrator tries to humor her by pretending that his letter had included some greetings to her. As he reads along, he keeps embellishing the letter so as to say more and more about her. Finally, he fabricates a wedding proposal from Zorba to Bubelina. She is delighted and asks the narrator if he would be their witness. Needless to say, when Zorba gets back, he was very surprised to learn of his fate. Two deaths in the book really shake up their philosophy and conversation about life. One is that of the widow Sormelina. The beautiful widow is pursued and desired by all the men on the island. She, on the other hand, does not allow any man near her. This rejection creates animosity in the minds of the men in the village. The narrator also feels attracted to the widow, but he is afraid to make a move. Zorba chastises him for not approaching her. He says, "My boy, if a woman calls you to her bed and you do not go, your soul is destroyed." Pavli, the son of one of the leading male citizens of the village, Mavradoni, is infatuated with the widow, but his father does not approve of it. Although all the men of the village hunger after the widow, none of them dare to approach her. She is very mysterious and deemed even to be evil at times. The young Pavli commits suicide because of his hopeless situation with the widow. The villagers hold the widow responsible and want to take revenge on her. But the narrator speaks of being rational and not blaming the widow for what poor Pavli had done. This calms them down for a while. After a while, during Easter, some of the men gather in the village and perform a resurrection dance. Suddenly, they spot the widow coming out of the church. The men crowd around her, forming a circle, and they try to kill her. As Mavrodoni is about to kill her, Zorba intervenes and tries to save her. But while his back is turned, Mavrodoni leaps on her and with a single blow of his knife he cuts off the widow's head. Zorba is shook by the incident and he tells the narrator, "I'm telling you, boss, all the things that happen here in this world are unjust. I don't sign my approval." The way she is murdered shows the cruelty of the Cretan peasants, and the hypocrisy of it lies in the fact that they were prompted to do it by their own jealousy and powerlessness in attaining her. To add to this, they kill her in the churchyard on the festive occasion of Easter. All this paints a very poignant picture of the plight of women. The other death in the book is that of Madame Hortense. She becomes ill and Zorba works hard to heal and encourage her. He summons the doctor for Hortense, but her high fever gets worse. In what is a very morbid scene in the book, the keeners assemble impatiently for her to die. They sing monologues while at the same time engage in stealing her belongings even before she is dead. Keeners are people who wail and sing in grief for the dead person. The Cretan peasant's behavior is both humorous and repulsive at the same time. The peasants enter her house and start stealing all of her possessions. Zorba tries to chase them away, but they keep coming back. When she dies, they refuse to call the priest for her because she is a European and an infidel, according to them. Zorba and the narrator watch as the villagers take out the dead body to the burial ground, dancing and singing, even as they get drunk and stuff themselves with food. Zorba, after this incident, broods over the question of death and he asks the narrator, "Why do people die?" And the narrator replies that he does not know. Zorba becomes outraged hearing this and he bursts out saying, "What then are those goddamned papers that you read? Why do you read them? If they don't tell you that, what do they tell you? Well, all these damned books you read, what good are they? Why do you read them if they don't tell you that? Why do you read them?" The narrator then launches into a lengthy monologue about his philosophy of life and death. The cable system that Zorba devises is finally set up, and the villagers and the monks gather to witness its inauguration. But Zorba's plans crash to the ground just like his grand cable system. Instead of being devastated by the loss, they eat lamb, drink wine, and dance together. The narrator runs out of money and he decides that his life in Crete is over. Zorba is troubled by this and he exclaims that he does not know what he would do without his boss. They part ways but keep in touch with each other through letters and postcards. Years later, the narrator receives a letter informing him of Zorba's death and Zorba's request that he inherit his Santuri. Zorba the Greek is composed primarily of philosophical dialogues between Zorba and the narrator about theology, life, death, romance, and sexuality. In many instances, Zorba asks very pertinent questions central to man's understanding of his existence. He asks questions like, when a person dies, can he be born again? Does God exist or not exist? They have discussions not in the hope of finding a right answer, but to bring together their different understandings of the world, which the narrator has gained through his books and Zorba through his experiences in life. Zorba, in both life and speech, represents the exact opposite point of view from that of the narrator. Zorba sees freedom as being fundamental to his existence. Incidentally, the narrator is also on a quest to attain some form of personal liberation through contact with the everyday life of human society, instead of being distant and observing life from a strictly intellectual and philosophical point of view. We find the narrator is racked with guilt for never having stepped outside of his book. You don't find him having transformed from an intellectual to a sensual being like Zorba at the end of the book. Even though he claims that Zorba has changed him, he continues to live his life of books. The narrator fails at being impulsive like Zorba, but he does what he knows best to do and decides to return to his books and writing. In their respective quests for liberation, Zorba seems to have embraced the way of the flesh and the narrator the way of the spirit. In the prologue to the Last Temptation of Christ, Kazantzakis writes, "My principal anguish and the source of all my joys and sorrows from youth onward has been the incessant, merciless battle between the spirit and the flesh." The attitudes that the narrator and Zorba have towards life have been compared to the two gods of the Greek pantheon, Apollo and Dionysus, respectively. Apollo is the god of light and reason, and Dionysus the god of wine and revelry. Zorba is the icon of passion and exuberance, and the narrator a man of reason and intellect. Despite being a 65-year-old man, Zorba is driven by a desire for women. He has been accused of misogyny by many critics. In a letter to the boss, Zorba writes, "I think only people who want to be free are human beings. Women don't want to be free. Well, is a woman a human being?" Women in the book mostly serve as sexual interests, and the conversation regarding women is a lot like the locker room talk among boys. When the narrator finds himself unable to pursue the widow, Zorba encourages him to step up. He says, "If a woman sleeps alone, the blame falls on us men, on all of us." Zorba relates to the narrator the stories of numerous sexual encounters he has had, also stories of his abandoned wives and children. For him, women seem to be only a kind of passionate adventure that he constantly seeks. Madame Hortense, the mysterious widow, and Agnosti's wife are all victims of the rural Cretan society that seems to be monstrous in their treatment of women. The book shows the huge influence that Bergson has had on Kazantzakis, especially his idea of élan vital, which is the vital force, a creative force, according to him, that is immanent in all organisms. He believed that it was this life force that led to evolution. Kazantzakis was also influenced by Bergson's idea of laughter as a corrective instrument in society, and he uses it in his book to look at certain aspects of the Cretan society. One of the priceless lessons that the narrator draws from Alexei Zorba is how laughter is a palpable form of this vital force. As Wook Tong Kim says in his article, laughter is an act of creativity, a life engaging, creative, vital force that not only makes human society better than it is, but also makes absurd human existence meaningful and thus more bearable. Kazantzakis was always controversial and misunderstood. He was accused of atheism in 1939 by the Greek Orthodox Church, especially after they were outraged by his depiction of Jesus in The Last Temptation of Christ. This book was placed on the index of forbidden books by the Roman Catholic Church. On his death, the Orthodox Church refused to give him a Christian burial. The epitaph on his gravestone reads, "I hope for nothing, I fear nothing, I am free." I hope you feel encouraged to read the book. Thank you for listening.